first of all, thanks everyone, and welcome to the second webinar organized by the Ireland for a World Beyond War. And thank you very much to join us this night. I just want to remind everyone that it's possible to make any comments and also write some questions using the chat that you can find below the screen. And I just kindly ask everyone to be kind and respectful when using the chat. And I now want to introduce our host for today, is Barry Sweeney. Barry is on the board of director of the World Beyond War and also the national coordinator for World Beyond War in Ireland. I now leave the floor to Barry.
Hey, thanks, Eva. Hello and welcome everybody to this evening's conversation. Today we're chatting with Clare Daly, who's a member of European Parliament. Clare comes from Dublin, Ireland, and for those of you who don't know her, she has a long history of being on the side of social progress. She's worked on many issues, including fighting against private bin charges, water charges, fighting for workers' rights, for protection for police whistleblowers, and against Ireland's abortion restrictions. She was jailed for a month over protesting against bin charges in 2013 and was arrested for breaching security at Shannon Airport in 2015 while attempting to search an American military planes going through Ireland. Clare, delighted and honoured to have you here today. Today we're going to be talking about militarism and politics, which of course they go hand in hand. It's governments who declare war. But today we're going to look more at the influence of the military-industrial complex on politics. But before we go into the details, I'd like to take you back in time, Clare, to when you grew up in Dublin, in conservative Catholic Ireland, of course. Ireland was quite restrictive at the time. And even you yourself, in your family, your father was a military man, and you had other members of your family who chose the religious life. And yet you were very vocal on social issues from a very early age. You immediately didn't go with the mainstream. I was wondering, could you tell us a little bit about what was that like, challenging your family, maybe what they believed, their views? Did you ever have any success changing your family's opinions?
Well, I suppose, obviously, I'm delighted to be here and thanks very much for having me. That was never really my objective, to change my family's views or to annoy them or to be a rebel or anything like that. I suppose I was always just what I am, and I would actually think that my family background really molded my social conscience in many ways. I mean, in Ireland, it's not peculiar in the sense that our army has a very high standing in opinion polls and in respect amongst the people. And for me, I think that's because of our peacekeeping role. We've not started wars or anything like that. We've tried to play a positive role globally. And I think Irish people take pride in that. It's kind of like being a passport internationally. Yeah, there were a lot of religious people in my family. Actually, we're from Kildare, by the way, not Dublin.
Okay.
I've just been accused of having a Dublin accent, having gone to college at 17, which wasn't today or yesterday, and I never ended up going home. But yeah, look, I respect everybody's views, and I mean, the Catholic workers have been huge in terms of fighting militarism and so on. There's been many sort of globally. I didn't want to change anybody's mind. Look, at every kid growing up has problems with their parents, I think. And yeah, I think for me, they're brilliant people and they're entitled to their own views. We don't really argue. We kind of tend to support each other. But probably the role in the army, my army background, my knowledge of how army personnel are treated poorly, and the peacekeeping role of the Irish Defence Forces probably actually molded me for good, for want of a better word.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, no doubt you're a very courageous, tenacious, outspoken person on many issues. In fact, you've just written a book with Mick Wallace called The Coalition of the Unwilling. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, we're delighted about it actually, and it's the culmination of a couple of years' work. And basically what this book is, maybe some people may or may not know, when myself and Mick Wallace were members of the Irish Parliament, working with Shannon Murch and other peace campaigners in Ireland, we time and time again put to the Irish government, why were they allowing our airport in a neutral country to be used on a daily basis by the US military? And it's not an insignificant number of troops. We are talking about hundreds of troops every day. And the government had the audacity to repeatedly tell us that no, they were just passing through, that these expensive, gigantic aircraft and these hundreds of military personnel were just going on their holidays, passing by. They weren't involved in war, they weren't involved in militarism, which clearly they were, and clearly that was a breach of our neutrality. So having tried I suppose, the parliamentary route to get answers, we didn't get any. And a lot of ministers would say to us, oh, go and, if you think there's weapons on it, go and find out yourselves. So like a long line of others, we went to try and search the planes. We broke into Shannon Airport, we were arrested. And the book essentially is an account of our trial, because we had some excellent note takers at the trial, which was a number of years ago, and they took down the testimony. And we would say, and you've got to buy the book to see if we're right, that we put the US military and the Irish government on trial, and we proved that there's weaponry going through. We proved that our neutrality was being breached. So the book is an account of the trial. It's an account of, I suppose, the circumstances that led us to break into Shannon, but also the history of Irish neutrality, why it's important, where it came from. And we're kind of proud as well that a key part of the book is, for the first time replicated anywhere, is the entire collection of the WikiLeaks cables in relation to Shannon Airport, which is just incredible reading, because it gives you an insight into what way the Americans think about Ireland's servility in allowing our airport to be used like this. So yeah, I mean, we're pretty proud of it, and we think it does. It puts the others on trial, and we obviously call it the Coalition of the Unwilling, because us and a whole number of other activists were the opposite of the US military and their gang of supporters, in that we are not willing to see ordinary people around the globe to be used as cannon fodder in the wars that facilitate just the arms companies and so on.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely fantastic, Clare. In fact, you touch on a very important point there, Irish neutrality. Many people believe Ireland is neutral. It's not in our constitution, but it's the general belief. Would you be of that belief?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the Irish government, and not just the current one, but successive Irish governments, sadly, including those which have included the Labour Party and the Green Party, who, when in opposition, would, have staunchly opposed in an active sense the use of the Shannon Airport by the US military. So, but the reality is that our neutrality has been completely compromised by successive governments. The very fact that Shannon is used on a daily basis, when we know that weaponry and troops transit through it, is proof positive of that situation. But the government kind of play this game where they say, oh no, but look, we're militarily neutral, like we're not going around starting wars. Yeah, well, obviously not, but being neutral is more than that. And we should be a positive force for peace, using our neutrality, which in many ways, we had that reputation of being kind of, the way when you go on holidays and people say, oh, you're English, and we go, how dare you? No, we're not. We're Irish. And they go, oh yeah, the Irish, we like them. We're kind of friends with everyone. And that was our passport, but it has been debased by the fact that we have allowed our airports to be used, and not by, the airport isn't being used by the Russians or the Venezuelans or whatever on a daily basis, it's by the US. But I think the point you make, in the hearts and minds of Irish people, they want us to be neutral, and opinion poll after opinion poll has validated that, and people want that, but it's not there, and it's not there in our constitution, which it should be, for the added, I suppose, legal protection to try and fight it back. But no, they have compromised us hugely, and not just through Shannon, but also through increasingly through our involvement in the growing EU militarism as well.
Yeah, I wanted to touch on that. I've heard about the European Army, but Michael Martin, the Prime Minister, says it's a conspiracy theory, and you're actually on the Security and Defence Committee in Europe, in Brussels. Could you shed a little light? Does it exist, or is it a conspiracy theory?
Well, I mean, there'll be a lot of people now after seeing the Irish government's handling of COVID now who would take with a grain of salt anything that Micheál Martin would be saying, but that's another issue. But yeah, I mean, look, you're right. And the irony was that when Micheál Martin made that famous statement, basically saying it was utter nonsense to think of an EU army, that very week, the leader of the political group in the European Parliament to which Fianna Fáil was affiliated was actually on the record of saying an EU army by 2024, let's do it. And they've been open about that. Of course, there isn't an EU army in place at the moment. And that's one of the things people in Ireland love to say, as in Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael say, oh, this is just fantasy land. This is just scaremongering. Where is it? We've been hearing about this nonsense since the Lisbon Treaty, but there is no army there. Now, these people who say that are either being deliberately disingenuous or they haven't kept up with the facts, because the reality on the ground has shifted dramatically since Lisbon. And yes, we do not have a European army where the countries of the EU have come together marching under one uniform. However, what we do have is a creeping, and actually not just creeping, an accelerating move towards collective EU militarism. And I think it's so important. I just want to give a few examples of that. The first thing is, in the last few years, we've had a seismic shift in EU funding. For the first time ever in this Parliament's budget, which was just recently ratified, we have EU money being used directly to fund the military. And the budgets range from covering the European Defence Fund, the appallingly named European Peace Facility, which is an abomination and has nothing to do with peace, the military mobility project and so on, where we're talking about billions, well over 13 billion in direct funding from EU budgets, which were never allowed before. But it's not just about money. And bear in mind, that money is not to pay the soldiers around Europe. That's on hardware. That's on the products of the arms industry. But it's not just that. If you look at other sections of the infrastructure, we have organizations now like the Military Planning and Conduct Capability. That was established in 2017. And the idea behind that is to sort of centralize military planning. It's like a headquarters, an EU military headquarters. And Neutral Ireland is on that. We've actually 6 Defence Forces personnel from Ireland located in Brussels. And when I asked the question at the EU Security and Defence Committee, but hang on a minute, is there not a contradiction there for the Irish fellows who'd be there at that when they've sworn with a constitution that talks about resolving conflict through peaceable means, and yet they're coordinating in a European military headquarters? And the general who was there before the meeting reassured me that I needn't worry, that the Irish Defence Forces personnel had never had a problem with any of the issues that they were asked to deal with, which was kind of missing my point to begin with. On top of that, we have what they call the strategic compass. And this is another thing as well, which is new. And this is about trying to persuade the 27 member states, all of whom have different perceptions and different ideas on it, that there's a common threat. Because you can't really be spending money on arms if there's no big bad wolf to spend it on. So we see increasing sort of Russia phobia, where the Russians are gathering on our borders. We're trying to have a common enemy, which clearly doesn't exist, and we've made that point. But just in case, and I want to give you a quote because I think it's scary, but it gives you an idea of the way they're thinking. As part of the EU Army project, we have the European External Action Service, who are kind of the advisors in terms of foreign affairs. And they've said about this strategic compass, and I'll give you a quote because it sums it up better than me. They've said, revisiting and updating our understanding that this is what the strategic compass is about. It's about revisiting and updating our understanding of threats and challenges, and in particular, our response to them. That this should help us towards a common strategic culture and reinforce the political will to use EU tools and instruments, pursuing EU values and interests. Now, what they really mean is we need to invent a common threat so that we can put to use some of this stuff that we're spending all the money on. So that's all going on, and that's real. Of course, there's divisions in the EU. France and Germany really want an EU army because they're the ones with the big arms companies. A lot of the Eastern Europeans would prefer to see NATO being bolstered. Clearly, the UK was one of the biggest supporters of NATO, and getting them out of the way clears the way for, we've seen the likes of Macron, von der Leyen and Merkel all advocating for an EU army. So look, it's not there yet, but anybody who says that that isn't the direction in which it's going is either lying or dim, to be honest about it. It's scary. And interestingly, actually, this week, Frontex, who are the European Union's border security guards who get a potload of money, a lot of it going to the same companies, they're now kitting themselves out in a new EU uniform. So they're the first, if you like, armed border force that are appearing in an EU uniform. So don't think that this isn't the direction that it's going. The money and the impetus is big time in that direction.
That's amazing to hear so much of that. Can I ask, just to compare the sort of investments available for other sectors, you know, renewable energy or health, education, you know, just to compare the sort of 13 billion with what's on offer to life-giving services, how do the others stack up?
Well, I think that's a really good example, and actually probably COVID brings it home to us because obviously everybody sees an enormous public health crisis. And interestingly, when the EU's initial response to that was, the European Commission said, listen, we need 9.4 billion immediately to deal with this across Europe. Now, health isn't a European Union competency. It's a competency of the member states, even though they've been neoliberal policies have dictated the state of EU member states' health budget. But nonetheless, they said they needed 9.4 billion to bolster medical supplies, dealing with COVID, cross-border cooperation and so on. Out of what they said, we really need 70 billion, but we need 9.4 billion first. The Council of Europe had a meeting in July, and this is this July now, in the midst of a pandemic, where they reduced that to 1.7 billion. Now, I've just said 13 billion for militarism, 1.7 billion. It went back up to 5 billion, 5.1 billion was the end figure. So 5.1 billion for EU for health, it's called, versus 13 billion, and that was a reduced 13 billion for the EU military budget. Not only that, but Frontex, who are the European borders guards, basically. One single agency, Frontex alone, this year is getting 5.6 billion, and it's not even the biggest one, but this is external border, 5.6 billion. We're giving health 5.1 billion, and the Frontex budget has actually increased 6,666% since its inception. We spent 22 billion on border management, and that's separate to the 13 billion on arms and militarism, 22 billion. That'll give you an idea. I mean, you mentioned correctly, Barry, about the challenges with the environment, and the just transition was a key in the European Green Deal, and we were given 40 billion to deal with the European Green Deal and the just transition. But they cut that by over 22 billion down to 17 billion. So you can weigh that up. That's supposed to be to alleviate the life-changing measures necessary to deal with climate change, and it's 17 billion, and militarism is 13 billion. And let's remember that it's not just, that's the direct EU funding for militarism. All of the member states spend out of their own budgets more and more and more, and arrangements like PESCO encourage them to do so. You're supposed to be spending 2% of your GDP. So we've countries like Bulgaria, which is the poorest country in the EU by miles, and massive corruption, spending a huge amount on buying new weaponry from the United States. It's absolutely appalling across the Union, and it's not surprising. Like, there's a reason for this. It's the lobbyists are in place at the center of it. The reason why we have this, and I mean, people may or may not know this, but before we had the PESCO, which is this structured cooperation, which Ireland volunteered to join. We didn't even have to join it. It was an opt-in. But this is requiring you to move in the direction of spending more and more on military hardware. But before that was set up, the EU set up what they called a group of personalities on defence research. Now, that wasn't, you know, George Clooney and any of them. There wasn't personalities like that coming along. The personalities actually were the CEOs of the arms companies. Most of them were the people. And their job was to advise the EU on how to support defence research. I wonder what they came up with. Oh, we need a European Defence Fund. And guess who got the money from that? The same companies that were part of the team. So that's the new circular economy. And as you said, compare it with what citizens of Europe should be getting their taxes spent on. It's frightening, and people don't know that, and the media don't let them know it.
Yeah, like I'm not sure what the Security and Defence Committee's thinking is. I don't know how you win pollution or you win an earthquake, but it's a worrying solution. It's the only tool in the box, it appears. I was wondering, could you tell me, so like the arms lobbyists, that's essentially the arms manufacturers.
Yeah. Oh no, like that advisory group, which was the group which came up with the idea of the European Defence Fund. So this was their outcome, that we need to have, and people should tune into the committees of the Security and Defence Committee of the European Union. You'll have top generals coming in, and they don't spare any punches. Like they don't do the sleight of hand that the Irish government ministers do. Actually, they reveal, they're proud of it. They talk about our industry. They give out, and a lot of the Eastern Europe, European MEPs will be giving out hell, not because we're spending too much, but because we're not spending enough. They're outraged. We need to stand alone from America. We need to put more into our industry. Like I've raised at that committee before about the PESCO projects and kind of like innocently saying, well, sure, look at, this is of no benefit to us in Ireland, like kind of thing. And your man said, don't worry. Irish companies will benefit. There's something for everybody in this. Again, sort of falling into the trap, like, you know, because they're saying, and they push this all the time, small and medium-sized companies, but actually it's the big players. And these were the people on the advisory board: Airbus, Saab, BAE, Leonardo, and they're all the ones getting the contracts. Like the group which was set up to advise the European Union on how it should deal with military research. The beneficiaries of the outcome of that, which was to pre-European defence funds with an acronym, 57% of the money's being spent went back to those companies which advised them in the first place, you know? So that's the circle. And you can see it in so many ways, like in terms of border management, in terms of, as I said, this European peace facility. This is the new circular economy now, and the same companies are popping up, and they're the big guys.
And actually, just that circular economy, it's like, if I'm right, the arms manufacturers who sell arms to under European values, of course, they sell them to Turkey, who use them in Syria. They sell them to Saudi Arabia, who use them in Yemen. And we create a refugee crisis. And then it's the same companies who run the borders. So that's also, like, they create their own clients, you know, they displace the people and then profit from their displacement.
That's not an exaggeration of the situation. It actually sums it up very well. We now have the obscenity where the European Defence Fund is being used to fund arms production. We have the European Peace Facility. Now, this one really annoys me because the name is so awful. And this replaced the African Peace Facility. And under the African Peace Facility, the monies were supposed to go in to help African countries to, you know, modernize, improve their whatever, you know, the usual, you know, let's ignore all the pillage and the colonialism, but we're giving something back. But anyway, it was specifically excluded. That fund could not be used for arms. Now we have it renamed as the European Peace Facility, and it can be used for arms. So what we'll have is one EU budget being used to produce arms, another EU budget being used to give to African countries to buy those arms. Then we'll have those arms being used in African countries, which has been completely destabilized, and the Sahel and all of that are a constant discussion in the EU. That will be used to displace people. Then those refugees who end up on Europe's borders will meet the same companies who will try and keep them out. And I mean, some of the developments there are absolutely scary, but we had what the Transnational Institute found that in the last number of years, the same military companies who make the arms have made a profit of at least just short of $1 billion from land walls and fences since the end of the Cold War. Now that's, as I say, it's not helicopters, it's not drones, it's not nighttime goggles, just from land walls and fences. They've made $1 billion profit, the arms companies. If you look at companies like the Integrated Border Management Fund, which is a $6.5 billion fund, a big portion of that is going to the arms industry as well. Member states are obliged to fortify their borders. The countries that want to join the EU have to do it as well, these candidate member states, as they call them, and the money for that. And I'll just give you one example without boring you, like, but you know, you look at Airbus, which everybody thinks is nice airplanes, but Airbus is a really big supplier of helicopters, which is used in, their helicopters are used in borders in Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Lithuania, and so on. But they also, the Germans use Airbus manufacture in Tunisia and so on. We see Israeli companies getting drone contracts. We see big companies too, the likes of Leonardo, the Italian firm, and so on, that a lot of the money is being used to track refugees, all of this type of stuff. But like, that's a multi-billion dollar fund as well, which is used, and the same names pop up in all of them.
Yeah, no, it's terrible. And just the last question, and then we'll open up to some questions from everybody here today. Like, with all these things happening, like a European army, Irish neutrality, like they should be newsworthy. I should hear about this in the news, but I never hear about it on RTE in Ireland, which of course is government funded, the same as the BBC in England, government funded. So they tell us a particular story. And meanwhile, Julian Assange exposed the dirty secrets of the military and the political world, yet he's in prison while the criminals get rewarded. What's your opinion on Julian's treatment?
Well, I mean, and I'm delighted that you said that, and I would really encourage everybody here to get involved with Free Assange Ireland, who are an absolutely excellent group who have really tried to put Julian's case on the map, to put pressure on the Irish government, to put pressure on the UK government, and now to put pressure on Joe Biden to stop pursuing Julian Assange, whose only crime was to expose the war crimes of the US. And this is what he is being extradited for nothing else other than the work he did around the Afghan and the Iraqi war. And I mean, to be honest, it's one of the biggest. It is obviously the press freedom case of a generation, but it's one of the greatest travesties ever. And I mean, I suppose I would just strongly encourage everybody to get involved with him, because you're right, information is power. And that's what WikiLeaks did. It gave the information about exactly what the US was engaged in. And if he had been put on trial at that time when that information was released, I honestly think there'd be millions of people on the streets demanding that he be let go. But the passage of time has sort of stood in the way of that. But it's the same for all of the information that we're dealing with here tonight. And it's the very reason why these events are so important, because we can give people this information. I mean, myself and Mick Wallace do a podcast every week, I Foresee Trouble, with Daly and Wallace, where we try and give the information of the European Parliament, because we're very conscious that the message isn't coming home, and that if a lot of Irish people were listening to this and seeing the amount of their money that was being wasted upon this, they'd be utterly shocked. And to be honest, that's one of the reasons why they get away with it, is there's this division between, I suppose, the population and those making the decisions. I mean, we have that accountability even problem at national level, but sometimes through mobilisations, there's a breakthrough. We got them to stop the water charges, you know, that sort of stuff. Sometimes you can, but holding European institutions to account is more difficult, which is why the media should be playing a more important role, but they don't, because as you say, they're state-owned or they're privately owned, which is why the service that Julian did was so important, and why events like tonight on social media are so important as well, to get that message out there, because that's not what the citizens of the world want.
Yeah, no, and I agree, getting the message out there is so vitally important, and that's why I'm so grateful you came tonight, Clare, and you gave us your time. It's been absolutely wonderful. I could ask you questions all night, but I think it's time for me to open up the floor. So thank you very much, Clare.
Thanks very much, Barry.
Yeah, lots of great questions coming in from the chat. Many questions about neutrality. If you could speak more about the benefits of neutrality, and specifically there were questions about, you know, what is the government's position on it? What is the Department of Defense's position on it? What is the Department of Foreign Affairs position? So basically kind of what is their position on neutrality? Has that position changed over the years?
Yeah, and I mean, it's a real intricate web of deceit that the Irish government runs, and it's deliberately done to hide what's actually going on in the likes of Shannon Airport, because we have a scenario where our constitution says that conflict should be sorted by peaceable means. Okay, neutrality is not specifically written in our constitution, but it's readily understood by our citizens as something that we shouldn't take sides or we shouldn't get involved. But the Irish government's approach is, so they say, and they divide it between 4 departments. So if you want information about what's going on, they say if it's a military aircraft using or transversing our airspace or landing, well then permission you have to go through the Department of Foreign Affairs for that one. If it's a civilian aircraft which has military people on it, well, then you have to go through the Department of Transport, who gives exemptions for that. Department of Foreign Affairs say they only allow military go through if they're not armed or not involved in wars, but they don't search them, because that would be a bit rude. We have to take a diplomatic word for that, even though time and again we've shown how that word is not worth its bond. It's completely flawed. Then we have the Gardaí, who are called to back up the defence forces. So we have the Department of Justice, which deals with the Gardaí, who mine the planes for the US, because it's the US who are always there. And then we have the Department of Defence, who are also there in that role. So they hide between the 4 of them. And if you ask one, they try and hide behind the other. So what does it mean, and what could it mean? I mean, to me, if Ireland is a very small country, but we do have a global standing far beyond our small size. And that could be a force for good, if you like, for positive neutrality, for peaceable, I suppose, resolution of conflict. And that's what we'd like to see Ireland to be involved in line with our peacekeeping history, that would be a much better way forward. For example, we're on the Security Council at the moment. We were on the Security Council at the time of the Iraq War, and we sat on the fence, and we allowed eventually a sort of a fudge that dressed up and ignored the facts that were there. We should have been sitting there spelling that out. We should be doing that there now, exposing that in this time of a global pandemic with a massive climate change challenge, that globally we're spending all this money on wars and weaponry. And interestingly, we've done a study on, because it's never taken into account, the carbon footprint of the military. It's not quantified in an EU sense. We have the results of a new study coming out on that as well, because not only, you know, it's contributing in that way as well. So Ireland could be calling all of that out in a positive way, but sadly, I mean, that hasn't been the case. You only have to see the shot in the arm that Francis Black's bill that went before the Shannon almost went through all stages of the Irish Parliament arguing for a boycotting of settlement goods in the shot in the arm that was for Palestinian people, and that the impact it had all over the world. Ireland standing up in a neutral way can have that impact, and that's the way we would see it.
A follow-up question on neutrality. How many other countries claim to be neutral? And also, can you speak more about the position of Irish MEPs on neutrality?
Yeah, I mean, officially, I don't have them all. I mean, there's a couple of the EU ones, the likes of Austria and Sweden and so on, are supposed to be neutral. But like Sweden, for example, would have a really very big arms industry actually and so on, and aren't really neutral at all, but they don't tend to. Denmark also has been staying out of some of those areas. I think in terms of Ireland, well, the way the Irish MEP, there are 13 Irish MEPs. 3 of the groupings now come from what are the government parties in Ireland. So you have 2 Greens, you have 5 members of the EPP, which is the biggest group in the Parliament, which Fine Gael are in, and 2 in Renew, which Fianna Fáil are in. So certainly Renew and the EPP would be very pro militaristic parties. They're in favour of more military expenditure. And the Renew group, or ALDE as they were called in the last European election, were open about an EU army, which makes Micheál Martin's protestation such a lie. We know that the EPP group, that Fine Gael went to them and asked them to remove the reference to an EU army from their election material because they didn't want the word getting out on that. So the Irish MEPs, it's funny, but they do sometimes, even in that, and the others, there's 1 Sinn Féin and 3 of us independents, and we're all in the small left group. So obviously we would be vocal on those issues. Generally speaking, sometimes for strategic ends, a lot of the Irish MEPs would follow our motions on neutrality, but unfortunately their parties don't do that at home. And it's a bit like, I suppose, when people look to the future and how do we change things, that will be an interesting one, because Sinn Féin has been very vocal about Shannon. They've been vocal about Irish neutrality. So the test will be if Sinn Féin go into power in the next government, and I hope they do, because we need a broad alternative. Well, then are they going to put their money through their mouth, where their mouth is, end the use of Shannon by the US and have a referendum on neutrality? Because I think that would be an important way forward of mobilising people. And I think the very fact that the Irish MEPs are attentive to what we do around this issue and sometimes strategically vote with us, even though all of their groups would vote differently, shows that they are susceptible to pressure on this. So we need to capitalise on that.
Great. There are several questions about Shannon. Can you speak about, who is profiting from Shannon Airport? Is it the everyday Irish people that are getting any benefit out of it? Kind of speak about the profiteering system around Shannon Airport.
Well, nobody is profiting from it directly, and certainly nobody in Ireland. It actually costs money to have them landing. It's the Irish taxpayer who generally foots the bill for that, because it's a reciprocal arrangement. And if the Irish Air Force landed in America, the Americans would pay for that. But seeing as we never do, and they land here a couple of times a day, the bill is not really evenly split. The Irish establishment would have you believe that this is a service that we almost should provide. We should be nice to our American friends, because our American friends give us lots of jobs through multinationals. But I mean, our attitude would be is that our American friends are the citizens of America who would much prefer to see their government spend their money on healthcare rather than a military. They'd much prefer to see those multinationals paying their taxes at home to enable US people in poverty to come out of poverty, rather than using Ireland as a tax haven. So we don't need, I don't think if we didn't give Shannon to the US that all these multinationals would uproot and leave. That's a nonsense. They're here for other reasons, because they make money, because it's a foot into the EU. It wouldn't happen like that, but that's the stick that's used. I think from an American point of view, of course, they have bases all over Europe. They don't actually need us in that sense. but politically they do, because it hooks us in and it's a nice one for them to have. So I think that's who's kind of benefiting from it. It brings us into the loop, and that's why it's there. And I think we really, the very fact that they put so much importance on involving us in this should make all of us in Ireland realise how important it is to resist that. Because should we be successful in stopping the use of Shannon, it would be worth a huge amount more than actually just the numbers going through. Politically, it will be a gigantic statement to make, actually. But, you know, sadly, Ireland has sort of replaced the years of British imperialism with a now kind of American imperialism almost through the foreign direct investment, which is tragic, but has been the stance of successive Irish governments.
In the chat, someone mentioned that there is an EU meeting tomorrow that might be declaring a lockdown, I guess, across Europe. Would this meeting or this lockdown potentially close Shannon Airport for the time being?
I'm not actually aware. I'm not really sure what's been referred to in that. I don't know. If it is, it's news to me. I mean, other than the lockdowns that we've had, I mean, I don't know. The Irish government will be responsible for, you know, travel in and out of Ireland. I don't think there's anything imminent on that. Now, I could be wrong, but I haven't heard anything in that regard. So I don't think so. And one of the disgusting travesties of the recent global pandemic was when there was basically all shutdown of civilian aircraft globally, that the US military continued to travel unabated during that crisis, bringing COVID to parts of Japan and so on, was absolutely disgraceful. But anyway.
Shifting gears, there's a question about Biden, and do you think that President Biden will be better for international peace than Trump was?
Now you froze there on me. I don't know. I didn't hear any of that. If something was said, I didn't hear any of it. You were just frozen on my screen, and then I see you back, but I didn't hear anything.
Oh, okay, I'll repeat it. I was saying, do you think, it's a question about whether you think President Biden will be better for international peace than Trump is?
Sadly, no. There's no evidence to say that. The irony is that vulgar, obnoxious, racist Trump shooted his mouth off an awful lot more. Actually, you know, he was the first US president in a long time who didn't start a new war. As I said, the likes of Joe Biden has been on the record saying that Trump wasn't harsh enough on Venezuela, which is not really a good sign. I think the narrative around Biden will change. The mainstream media will sort of say, oh, now we're back to normal. But back to normal under Democratic presidents has meant just the same military-industrial complex treading around the globe, probably even worse. I mean, Obama's record was probably in some ways militarily worse than Trump's. So I don't think there's any reason, given that Biden's team, if you like, are very much similar to Obama's, that it will be any different. There will be some changes. Maybe there'll be changes around Iran a bit. You know, there'll be some, the likes of the Cubans will be hoping that the more normalized relations that had been a little bit opened up with Obama and were set back under Trump would be reversed a bit. But sadly, no, I don't think there is any cause for optimism there. And that means the reality that was always there, that we can't rely on the establishment in America or in the European Union or in Ireland or anywhere else. The peace movement globally has to rely only on the ordinary men and women around the globe, the former veterans who've seen the other side, who agitate around these issues. And it's only through direct mobilization that we will force a change and sense into the situation.
I know that we are pretty much out of time, so I will just ask one more question from the chat. How would you manage the EU borders?
Well, I mean, the first thing we need to do is stop invading countries, stop destabilizing countries, and stop making countries so unbearable that people can't live in the countries in which they were born. Most people would prefer to live in the countries in which they were born, with their families, their friends, their social networks, if they could. So that's the first thing. Everybody should have the right to live in their own area. I also believe that everybody should have the right to go and visit other countries and to live and work in them if they like, including if they want to better their lot and if they want to just migrate for economic reasons. why shouldn't they? The whole of America is full of Irish people who've been doing that for generations, or so we're told anyway, including Joe Biden as well. So I think anybody who wants to come and live and work in the EU should be allowed to do so. We'd save a lot of money in a lot of the repressive measures if we didn't spend so much money there. So I think we should invest in proper assistance to countries. We should stop robbing the global south. We should stop attempting regime changes around the world to enable people to live in their own country. And then anybody who wants to come and live here, let them come and live here, to work, to contribute, as I say, the way Irish people did. There's no need at all for these securitized borders. They don't work. They only enrich the same arms companies who profited from the need to them to be there in the first place. And it's a falsehood that allows the establishment off the hook, because people then are looking at this monster on the border rather than, and diplomacy is the way, dealing diplomatically with our neighbours. Where there is conflict, they should be sorted through peaceable means, through a proper international peacekeeping arrangement where possible. The UN has badly let us down in that regard, but you know, that's a separate discussion probably, but well, it is a big separate discussion, but I think diplomacy and proper investment in resources, tackling climate change and the reasons that force people to leave anyway is the best, and then allow anybody who wants to come and visit or live here if they want.
Thank you so much, Claire. Barry and Ava, I'll turn it back to you, and I'll also share the poll results right now from earlier.
Okay, so the poll results, 71% of people think Ireland should not be part of a European army. Only 4% say yes, and 25% are not sure. I'm not going to say anything really. I'm going to hand over to Ava, who's going to do the conclusion. I would just like to say, I see both Ken and Tarek are here today. Another two activists who are putting the Irish government on trial for the use of Shannon Airport. We're looking forward to you coming back, guys, and we'll be supporting you in exposing the government's behaviour.
Thanks, Barry, and also thanks, Claire. It was really amazing and everything was clear and you answered all our questions, so thank you very much. Thank you again, everybody, to join us this night. And before leaving, I just want to remind you that you can now register for the third event that will be the next Wednesday. So basically for other 3 Wednesdays, we have this conversation, so join us if you wish. I also sharing now in the chat some of the link that you might be taking consideration. The first one is if you would like to sign for the peace declaration, and also in that link you can join us in an Irish group with the World Beyond War, or if you want, you can just support us with some donation. I put also the link for that. I just want to ask you also if you would like to subscribe. We have a Twitter page, a Facebook page, and an Instagram page, and you can find us with the name Ireland for a World Beyond War. Thank you so much one more time to join us this night. Good night, and I hope to see you everyone like the next Wednesday. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you.